In 1974, a New York City subway train operator vanished during his late-night shift. 50 years later, his entire train was found, sealed inside an abandoned private subway tunnel nobody even knew existed. For decades, the official story was that Walter Jensen simply abandoned his family and his post, a man who just walked away. But his niece, Clara, recently uncovered a secret that proves that story was a lie. And when investigators finally pry open the doors to his ghost train, they find his final message scrawled in a dusty logbook, a warning that points to a cover-up so vast, it was designed to stay buried forever. What truth was so terrifying that an entire train, and the man driving it, had to be erased from the city map? Subscribe. It helps these stories to reach people who lost hope and inspire them to keep seeking truth. And drop your city and local time in the comments. It's always fun to see our map light up. The air in her late uncle's attic was thick with the scent of dried cedar and 50 years of settled dust. To Clara Jensen, a woman who had spent a lifetime breathing in the quiet musk of libraries, it felt like home. At 58, with her own life neatly catalogued and shelved, she found a strange comfort in sifting through the archives of others. Especially the archives of a man she barely knew, a ghost in her family's photo albums. Uncle Walter. The name was always spoken in a whisper, the story that followed as thin as tracing paper. A subway operator who, on a sticky summer night in 1974, had simply vanished. Her parents had explained it with the tired shrug of adults who have accepted an ugly truth. He ran off, they'd said. Left his wife, his son, everything. The shame of it had settled over their family like a low-hanging fog, a quiet, persistent dampness that never truly lifted. Clara, even as a little girl, had never fully believed it. There was a photograph of him in her mother's keepsake box, a man with kind eyes and a smile that didn't belong to someone who would just walk away from his own life. She pried open the lid of a heavy leather-strapped trunk, the hinges groaning in protest. Inside, nestled among moth-eaten woolens and yellowed newspapers, was his uniform. A thick, dark blue jacket from the Metropolitan Transit Authority, its brass buttons tarnished with age. She ran her fingers over the stiff fabric, imagining him wearing it, feeling the weight of the city on his shoulders. Beneath the jacket was a small, velvet-lined box. It wasn't locked. Clara's heart gave a little skip, the way it did when she found a rare first edition tucked away on a forgotten shelf. She lifted the lid. There, resting on faded black felt, was a conductor's whistle. It was heavy, solid brass, polished to a dull gleam. It felt substantial in her palm, a tool of authority, of responsibility. But it wasn't the weight of it that made the air catch in her throat. It was the engraving. On its smooth side, in neat, precise lettering, were the words, Walter Jensen, and beneath his name, a date. July 14th, 1974. The date punched the air from her lungs. It was the exact day he disappeared, the exact night of his last shift. And beneath the date, another detail that made her mind reel, the official seal of the MTA. A jolt, electric and clarifying, shot through her. A warmth spread through her chest, a sudden fierce sense of hope that felt almost painful after so many years of cold silence. Why would the transit authority gift a man a commemorative whistle on the very night he supposedly abandoned his post? You don't give a man a medal for desertion. You don't honor a man who brought shame to the uniform. It didn't make sense. The family story, the one that had been the foundation of so much sorrow, had a crack running right through it. For the first time, Clara felt she wasn't just looking at the past. She was holding a piece of it, a piece that told a different story. It was a key. She knew with a certainty that settled deep in her bones that this little brass whistle was the key to unlocking the truth of what really happened to the man with the kind eyes. She felt a surge of purpose so strong it almost made her dizzy. She had to show this to someone. She had to show it to Mark. Mark, Walter's son, had grown up under the long shadow of his father's abandonment. He was a man shaped by that single defining act of desertion. His personality hardened into a cynical, resentful shell. Clara knew this. She knew he hated talking about his father. But this, she thought, this would change everything. This was not a ghost story. It was evidence. Driven by the adrenaline of her discovery, she picked up the phone, her hand trembling slightly. She didn't stop to think, didn't plan her words. She was a librarian who had found the missing page, and she just wanted to share the incredible news. Her voice was too bright, too eager when he answered. "Mark, it's Clara. I'm at Uncle Walter's house, going through some things. You won't believe what I found." She tried to explain, her words tumbling over one another in her excitement, the whistle, the date, the MTA seal, but the line was silent. Not a silence of curiosity, but a cold, heavy one. A wall going up. "You shouldn't be digging around in that stuff, Clara," he finally said, his voice flat and hard. "There's nothing there but bad memories." She tried again, insisting this was different, this was important, but he cut her off. "Meet me at the diner on Lexington, in an hour, and bring it." The diner was a sterile, brightly lit place that smelled of stale coffee and disinfectant. It was the perfect, soulless setting for the conversation that followed. Mark slid into the booth opposite her, not even bothering to take off his coat. He looked older than his 54 years, his face etched with a permanent frown. He didn't ask how she was. He just stared at the small velvet box she placed on the table between them. "So this is it?" he asked, his voice laced with contempt. "The thing that's going to fix 50 years of him being gone?" Clara opened the box, her movements slow, almost reverent. She wanted him to see what she saw, a piece of his father's honor restored. But Mark didn't look at it with wonder. He looked at it like it was a loaded weapon. "They gave it to him for 10 years of service, Clara. It was a token. It doesn't mean anything." Clara shook her head, her frustration mounting. "But on that exact night, Mark? Doesn't that seem strange to you? It proves he was there, he was working. He didn't just run away." That's when the dam of his carefully constructed anger finally broke. He slammed his hand on the table, making the salt shaker jump. Heads turned in their direction. "He did run away!" Mark hissed, his voice a low, vicious snarl that was more shocking than a shout. "He ran away from my mother. He ran away from me. He was a coward who couldn't handle his own life, so he took the easy way out. I have lived with that my entire life. I have made my peace with it. And now you show up with this toy? And you want to stir it all up again? You want to pretend he was some kind of hero?" The raw, bottomless pain in his eyes stunned Clara into silence. She had been so focused on the mystery, on the objective truth, that she had completely forgotten about the boy who had waited by the door for a father who never came home. She had thought she was offering him a lifeline, a chance to rewrite his painful history. But to him, she was just tearing open a scar to see if it would still bleed. "What do you want, Clara?" he demanded, his voice trembling with a rage born of decades of hurt. "Do you want to clear his name? Why? So you can feel better? It's not going to bring him back. It's not going to change what he did to us." He stood up, shoving his chair back with a scrape. "Leave it alone. Some things are buried for a reason. Let him rest in peace." Or in whatever gutter he ended up in. He walked out of the diner without another word, leaving Clara sitting alone in the booth, the small velvet box, a gaping wound on the Formica tabletop. The hope that had filled her just hours before had curdled into shame and a profound, aching loneliness. She had not only failed to connect with her cousin, she had pushed him away, possibly forever. That evening she drove to the cemetery. There was no body buried there, of course. Just a small granite headstone Walter's heartbroken wife had placed as a final, desperate act of remembrance. It simply read, "Walter Jensen, husband and father, lost 1974. No date of death, because for his family, every day since had been the day he died." The granite was cold under her hand. The silence of the place was different from the silence in the attic. This was the silence of finality, of acceptance. Mark was right. She was stirring up dead rumors, chasing ghosts. But as she stood there, the heavy brass whistle clutched in her fist, she looked at that word on the stone. Lost. Not abandoned. Not runaway. Lost. It felt right. He didn't leave, she thought. He was taken. The lie wasn't Walter's. It was the story itself. The world, the city, even their own family had accepted a version of events that made no sense. And in that quiet, lonely place, Standing over an empty plot of land, a new feeling began to displace her shame. A cold, hard resolve. She leaned down, her lips close to the chiseled name. "I'll find the truth they buried, Uncle Walter," she whispered, her voice a fragile thread in the evening chill. "I'll find out what they did to you, I promise." She stayed there for a long time as the sky bled from orange to deep indigo, the weight of her vow settling around her. When she finally turned to leave, a faint glint of light from the far end of the cemetery lane caught her eye. It looked like the reflection off a car's windshield, parked deep in the shadows beneath an old oak tree. She frowned. The gates had been locked an hour ago. No one else should have been there. A sudden, prickling sensation crawled up her spine, the feeling of being watched. She scanned the darkness, but saw nothing. Just the silhouettes of tombstones, standing like silent, patient sentinels, but she couldn't shake the feeling. Her quiet, personal promise, whispered only to a ghost, had somehow been overheard. The promise she made at Walter's grave was a cold stone in her stomach, both a source of strength and a constant, heavy reminder of her isolation. After the disastrous meeting with her cousin Mark, Clara knew she was truly alone in this. The family had closed ranks around their comfortable, painful story, and she was the heretic threatening to tear it down. So she did what she had always done when faced with an impossible question. She went to the archives. For 2 weeks, the quiet, dusty halls of the New York Public Library and the city's municipal records office became her sanctuary and her hunting ground. She wasn't just a retired librarian anymore. She was a detective, patiently sifting through microfiche reels of old MTA union newsletters and employee rosters from the 1970s, her eyes burning from the strain of staring at faded print. Names scrolled by, thousands of them, a ghost army of transit workers who had kept the city moving. Most were dead. Others had moved away, their trails gone cold. But then, after days of fruitless searching, one name leaped out at her from a 1976 retirement notice. Frankie Alvarez, track inspector, Sector 4, Manhattan Line, Walters Line. The notice mentioned he'd retired early due to health concerns. It was a long shot, but it was the only shot she had. Finding him was surprisingly easy. He was still listed, living in the same small apartment in the Bronx that he'd lived in for 60 years. When she knocked on his door, the man who answered was small and stooped, with skin like wrinkled parchment and eyes that seemed to hold the permanent sadness of a long-held secret. He was 79, and looked every day of it. He eyed her with suspicion, his body language a closed door. "I'm Clara Jensen," she said, her voice softer than she intended. "I'm Walter Jensen's niece." At the sound of Walter's name, something flickered in his eyes, not recognition, but fear. It was there and gone in an instant, but she saw it. "Don't know the name," he said, his voice a gravelly mumble as he started to close the door. It was a lie, and they both knew it. In a moment of desperation, a move that felt both reckless and necessary, Clara blocked the door with her foot. "Please," she said, her voice cracking slightly. "I just want to understand what happened to him." She reached into her purse and pulled out the small velvet box. She opened it and held out the brass whistle. "They said he ran away, but I found this. It's dated the night he disappeared." Frankie Alvarez stared at the whistle, his face a mask of disbelief. He slowly reached out a trembling hand, his gnarled fingers brushing against the cool metal as if he expected it to burn him. He took it from her, his breath catching in a ragged, shallow gasp. For a long moment, he just stood there in the dimly lit hallway, turning the small object over and over in his palm. It was as if she hadn't handed him a piece of brass, but the full weight of 1974. The armor of denial he had worn for 50 years finally crumbled. He looked up at her, his dark eyes shimmering with unshed tears. "Come in," he whispered, his voice thick with an emotion she couldn't yet name. His apartment was like a museum of a life lived. Every surface was covered with old photographs of his late wife and children, ceramic figurines, and stacks of well-worn books. It was cramped and smelled faintly of soup and old wood, but it felt safe. It felt like a place where secrets could be kept. He led her to a small kitchen table and sat down heavily, the whistle still clutched in his hand. "He didn't run," Frankie said, his voice barely audible. "Walter? He was a good man. The best. Always had a smile for you. Always asked about my kids." The words came slowly at first, then faster. A torrent of memory and guilt pouring out of him. That night, July 14th. I wasn't even supposed to be there. But there was a problem with a switching signal near the Hudson Yards junction. A ghost signal, we called it. Kept tripping for no reason. I went down to check it myself. He paused, his eyes focused on something far away. A scene playing out in his mind. It was late, after midnight. I was down on the tracks, hidden in an alcove. That's when I saw it. His train. Number 724. It came through right on schedule. I saw Walter in the operator's car. He saw me, gave me a little wave. Just like always. Clara leaned forward, her entire body rigid with anticipation. This was it, the last moment anyone ever saw him. "And then?" she prompted gently. Frankie swallowed hard. "And then it didn't do what it was supposed to do, the switch. It threw the train, it diverted him. Not onto the express track, onto a spur. An old dead track that led into the wall." His voice dropped to a conspiratorial whisper. "It was a tunnel, Miss Jensen, underneath 9th Avenue. A sealed tunnel that wasn't on any of the official maps. I heard the brakes scream, a sound I never heard before. And then, it was gone. The whole train. Swallowed by the darkness. The air in the small room felt electric. A thrill, sharp and terrifying, shot through Clara. This was the truth. It was wild, unbelievable, but it was the truth. "Did you tell anyone?" she asked, her heart pounding against her ribs. Frankie's face crumpled with shame. "I tried," he said, his voice breaking. "I went to my supervisor the next morning. I told him what I saw. He looked at me like I was crazy. He told me I was drunk, that I was seeing things. Then he told me to shut my mouth about it, or I'd lose my job, my pension, everything. I had a wife, 3 kids to feed. What could I do? So I kept my mouth shut. And I have lived with that poison inside me every single day for 50 years. A wave of sympathy washed over Clara, so powerful it almost brought her to tears. She reached across the table and placed her hand over his. "You can't blame yourself, Frankie. They made you stay silent." For the first time, a glimmer of light, of defiance, returned to the old man's eyes. He nodded slowly. "They tried to erase him, but I never forgot." He stood up, his movements stiff, and walked over to a crowded bookshelf. From behind a row of encyclopedias, he pulled out a small, spiral-bound notebook, its cover stained with grease and age. He brought it back to the table and opened it. The pages were filled with his spidery handwriting and, more importantly, detailed hand-drawn sketches. "I kept my own logs," he said, a note of pride in his voice. "Everything the bosses didn't want us to write down. The ghost signals, the faulty tracks, the places that weren't supposed to be there." He flipped to a page dated July 1974. There, in faded pencil, was a meticulously drawn diagram. A junction, switches, and a dark line veering off into nothing labeled 9th Avenue Spur, sealed. Beneath it were coordinates and notes about a manual override lever. "This is it," he said, tapping the page with a trembling finger. "This is how they did it." He slid the notebook across the table to her. "You take it. Maybe you can do what I was too afraid to do. You can show them all they lied." Clara stared down at the notebook, her vision blurring with tears. It was more than a clue. It was a confession. It was the map she had been looking for. The hope that swelled in her chest was so bright it felt like sunlight. A 50-year-old crime was finally, impossibly, coming into the light. In that moment, she felt an overwhelming sense of connection, to Frankie, to her uncle, to the very idea of justice. With a librarian's instinct for preservation, she pulled out her phone and, explaining she wanted a backup, took a quick, clear photograph of the drawing on the open page. 3 days later, that single photograph was all she had left. High on her victory, Clara had spent the time poring over the notebook, cross-referencing old city maps, feeling for the first time like she was in control. She called Frankie to thank him again, and to ask a small question about a symbol he had used. But the voice that answered the phone was not the voice of the defiant old man who had unburdened his soul. It was the choked, terrified whimper of a caged animal. "Don't call me," he whispered, his voice frantic. "You have to stay away. They know. They came here. Oh God, they know." The line went dead. A cold dread, sharp and immediate, washed over her, extinguishing the warm glow of her recent hope. She raced to his apartment, her mind a whirlwind of terrible possibilities. The front door was splintered near the lock, pushed slightly ajar. She called his name, her voice swallowed by the eerie silence within. Pushing the door open, she gasped. The small, ordered apartment was destroyed. It had been ransacked with a brutal, methodical precision. Cushions were slashed, books were torn from their shelves, floorboards had been pried up. It wasn't a robbery. It was a search for something specific. She found him in the kitchen, huddled on the floor beneath the table, wrapped in a blanket, shaking so violently the floor seemed to vibrate with him. He didn't look up at her. He just stared at the wall, his eyes vacant with trauma. "They took it," he whispered, rocking back and forth. "The books, all my notebooks, everything. They said if I ever spoke to you again, if I ever spoke to anyone." He trailed off, his body racked with a shuddering sob. The man who had found the courage to speak the truth after 50 years had been silenced, utterly and completely broken. The notebook was gone. The evidence was gone. As Clara backed away, her heart a block of ice in her chest, she felt a profound guilt. She had done this. Her search for the truth had brought this terror down on an innocent old man. As she fled the building and scrambled into her car, that chilling, unmistakable sensation returned, the feeling of being watched. She looked in her rearview mirror. Half a block away, under a streetlight, sat a dark, unremarkable sedan. It had no reason to be there. Her promise at the grave had not been a private whisper. It had been a declaration of war. And now, the other side was firing back. The guilt was a physical thing now, a cold film on Clara's skin. For days, she did not leave her apartment. The city outside her window, once a comforting tapestry of life and movement, had become a landscape of threats. Every shadow held a man in a dark coat. Every passing car was the sedan she'd seen lurking outside Frankie's building. She replayed the image of the old man's ransacked apartment, of his vacant, terrified eyes, over and over in her mind. Her quest for justice, her righteous promise made at a graveside, had brought ruin to an innocent person. The weight of that responsibility was crushing. She had the single photograph of Frankie's hand-drawn map on her phone, a fragile, digital ghost of the truth. But what could she do with it? Who would believe the ramblings of a traumatized old man and the conspiracy theories of a retired librarian? They had broken him, and in doing so, they had broken her nerve. She was a woman who organized books, not a woman who fought monsters in the dark. The monsters, she now realized, with sickening clarity, were real, and they knew her name. A week after the attack on Frankie, her landline rang. It was an unfamiliar number. Her first instinct, born of this new, suffocating paranoia, was to ignore it. But a different, more defiant part of her, the part that had made the vow in the first place, picked up the receiver. "Clara Jensen?" the voice on the other end said. It was smooth, cultured, and utterly calm, a voice accustomed to being obeyed. "My name is Richard Hale. I'm a public safety consultant, formerly with the MTA. I understand you have some concerns regarding your late uncle Walter Jensen. I was in your neighborhood and was hoping I might stop by for a brief chat. I think I can clear some things up for you." It wasn't a request, it was a summons. Clara's blood ran cold. He hadn't asked for her address, he just knew it. She knew she should say no, that she should hang up and lock her doors, but she heard herself say, "I'll be here." She needed to see the face of the man who had orchestrated this terror. She needed to know her enemy. 20 minutes later, he was at her door. Richard Hale looked exactly like his voice sounded. Expensive. He was in his late 60s, with a mane of perfectly coiffed silver hair, a tailored charcoal suit, and a smile that was polished to a brilliant, empty shine. He looked like he belonged on a billboard promoting civic virtue, not standing on the worn welcome mat of her modest apartment. He carried with him an aura of untouchable power. "Thank you for seeing me, Miss Jensen," he said, his eyes doing a quick, dismissive scan of her living room before settling on her. He exuded a disarming charm that made her skin crawl. He accepted the offer of a chair, but refused a drink, sitting with a perfect posture that was both relaxed and predatory. "I'll be direct," he began, his voice dropping to a confidential, almost paternal tone. "Word has reached certain circles that you've been digging. Asking questions about events that took place a very long time ago. Events that, frankly, are best left undisturbed." He smiled that empty smile again. "I'm here as a friend, to offer some friendly advice." "What happened to Frankie Alvarez?" Clara asked, her voice shaking slightly but holding firm. She would not be cowed, not in her own home. A flicker of something, annoyance, surprise, crossed Hale's face before being smoothed away. "Ah, Mr. Alvarez. A sad case. A former employee with a history of confusion, prone to fanciful stories." As he said the word fanciful, his right hand went to his chest and he unconsciously smoothed the silk of his tie. It was a small, neat, almost invisible gesture. "You see, Miss Jensen, sometimes in a system as vast as our city's transit, myths are born. Stories of ghost trains, hidden tunnels, dangerous myths. They can be very compelling, but they have no basis in reality." He was lying, she knew it. The way he so easily dismissed a terrified, broken man made a hot, potent anger begin to burn through her fear. "My uncle didn't abandon his family," she stated, her voice gaining strength. "He was a good man." Hale's smile tightened at the edges. "I'm sure he was, which is why it would be such a shame to tarnish his memory by associating it with these conspiracy theories." His hand went to his tie again, a smooth downward stroke. "Spreading misinformation can have unfortunate consequences, for everyone." The friendly pretense was gone. This was the threat. It hung in the air between them, thick and suffocating. "The MTA pension board, for example," Hale continued, his voice as casual as if he were discussing the weather. "They have clauses, you know, morality clauses. Clauses about bringing the authority into disrepute. Records can get misplaced. Clerical errors can happen. It would be a tragedy if, after a lifetime of service in our city's school system, your own retirement were to be jeopardized." The blood drained from Clara's face. This was a different kind of violence. It wasn't a boot kicking in a door. It was the slow, silent strangulation of her entire life, her security, everything she had worked for. She had expected threats, but not this. Not the cold bureaucratic cruelty of an institution turning its immense weight against a single, ordinary woman. All the fight went out of her, replaced by a deep, nauseating dread. He saw it in her eyes. He had won. He stood up, the picture of professional courtesy. "I'm glad we had this talk, Miss Jensen. I trust you'll make the wise decision. Let the dead rest." He walked to the door, and just before he left, he turned back to her, that brilliant, empty smile fixed on his face. "Have a lovely day." The moment the door clicked shut, Clara's legs gave out, and she sank onto the floor, her body trembling. She was out of her depth, drowning. Hale hadn't just threatened her, he had shown her how completely powerless she was. She had one grainy photo on her phone and a promise to a dead man. He had the entire system at his beck and call. For the first time, she considered giving up. She could delete the photo, put the whistle back in its box, and try to forget everything. She could go back to her quiet life, her safe life. But the image of her uncle's kind eyes in that old photograph, and the memory of Frankie's terror-filled ones, wouldn't let her. To stop now would be to let them win, to let them bury the truth forever. She couldn't do that. But she also knew, with absolute certainty, that she couldn't do this alone. She needed help. Not a lawyer, not the police. They were part of the system Hale controlled. She needed someone who understood the darkness but wasn't owned by it. Her neighbor, Maggie O'Connor. A retired NYPD detective, Maggie had lived in the apartment next to hers for 20 years. Their relationship was one of polite, neighborly nods, of bringing in each other's mail and watering plants during vacations. Maggie was brisk, pragmatic, and had a way of looking at you that felt like she was seeing every lie you'd ever told. Clara had always been slightly intimidated by her. Now, she was her only hope. With a resolve born of pure desperation, Clara walked out of her apartment and knocked on Maggie's door. It felt like the hardest thing she had ever done. Maggie opened it, a half-finished crossword puzzle in one hand, an unimpressed look on her face. "Clara, everything okay? You look like you've seen a ghost." The words hung in the air. "More than one," Clara replied, her voice barely a whisper. She explained everything. From the whistle in the attic, to the ransacked apartment, to the chilling visit from Richard Hale, she expected Maggie to dismiss her, to tell her she was being paranoid. But as she spoke, she saw the detective's expression shift from casual curiosity to a sharp, focused intensity. She didn't interrupt. She just listened, her gaze unwavering. When Clara finished, her voice choked with fear and exhaustion. The apartment was silent. "Let me get this straight," Maggie finally said, her voice a low, steady rumble that was strangely comforting. "Some silver-haired snake from the MTA waltzes into your apartment and threatens your pension because you're asking questions about a man who disappeared 50 years ago?" Clara nodded, tears welling in her eyes. Maggie let out a short, harsh laugh that held no humor. "Yeah, that sounds about right." She looked at Clara, really looked at her, and saw not a hysterical librarian, but a woman who had stumbled into something deep and rotten. "You're in over your head, Clara. These guys don't make idle threats." For a moment, Clara's heart sank. She thought this was the part where Maggie told her to run. But then her neighbor said, "Which means you can't run. All that'll do is convince them you're scared. From now on, you're not alone. We're a buddy system. You don't go anywhere without telling me. You don't answer calls from numbers you don't know. And you give me a copy of everything you have, starting with that picture on your phone." A wave of relief, so powerful it almost buckled her knees, washed over Clara. She wasn't powerless anymore. She wasn't alone. In the sturdy, no-nonsense presence of this woman who had seen the worst of the city and hadn't flinched, she felt a flicker of hope reignite. For the first time in days, she felt she could breathe again. That night, just as she was about to fall into an exhausted sleep, her phone rang, a number she didn't recognize. Her hand froze, hovering over the screen. She remembered Maggie's words, and with a shaky finger, she declined the call. A moment later, it rang again. Same number. She declined it again. The third time it rang, against her better judgment, she answered, her heart hammering against her ribs. She didn't say anything. For 5 long seconds, there was nothing but silence. Not dead air, but the distinct, chilling sound of a held breath on the other end of the line. Then, a soft click. The line went dead. They knew. They were watching her every move. And now, they knew she wasn't answering their calls. Having Maggie on her side changed everything. The oppressive weight of fear didn't vanish, but now it was shared. It was manageable. Maggie's pragmatism was an anchor in Clara's sea of anxiety. She took one look at Frankie's map, cross-referenced it with old subway blueprints she accessed through a retired cop network, and within 2 days she had a target. "It's a service tunnel," Maggie announced, pointing a thick finger at a spot on a city plan spread across her kitchen table. "Officially decommissioned in 1968 after a minor collapse. Runs right under an old freight yard near 9th Avenue, just like your man Frankie said. If there's a sealed spur, it's in there." Hope, fragile but persistent, bloomed again in Clara's chest. This wasn't just a story anymore. It was a place on a map. A real place. Maggie's plan was simple and direct, spoken with the calm authority of a woman who had walked into dangerous situations her entire career. "We go in late, Saturday night. The yard's mostly dead then. I know a guy who owes me a favor, works security in that sector. He'll look the other way for 20 minutes. It's not much, but it's enough to get a look." The decision to go was both terrifying and exhilarating. Clara, the cautious librarian who alphabetized her spice rack, was about to break into a condemned city tunnel. The idea was so wildly out of character that it felt like a dream. But the thought of her uncle, alone in the dark for 50 years, was more real than her fear. This was a flawed, reckless decision, driven by a desperate need for proof, and she knew it. She was putting Maggie, and herself, in physical danger based on the memories of a traumatized old man and a single photograph. But to stop now felt like a betrayal worse than any risk. She had to see it with her own eyes. The night of the expedition was cold and damp, a miserable New York City drizzle slicking the streets and blurring the streetlights. Dressed in dark clothes and sensible shoes, Clara felt like a child playing a game she didn't understand. Maggie, on the other hand, was completely in her element, moving with a quiet confidence that calmed Clara's frayed nerves. They slipped through a gap in a chain-link fence, the sounds of the city instantly muted by the high walls of the freight yard. The air here was heavy with the smell of diesel and decay. They found the entrance to the service tunnel behind a pile of discarded shipping pallets, exactly where Maggie's contact said it would be, a heavy, rusted steel door with a simple padlock. Maggie produced a set of bolt cutters and snapped the lock with a loud, sickening crack that echoed in the silence. The sound made Clara flinch. This was it. There was no turning back. The darkness inside was absolute, a thick, heavy blackness that swallowed the beams of their flashlights. It was colder down here, a damp, subterranean chill that seeped into her bones. The air was stale, smelling of wet concrete and something else, something metallic and old, like forgotten machinery. They moved slowly, their footsteps echoing unnervingly in the long, cylindrical passage. Water dripped from the ceiling, each drop a percussive beat counting off the seconds. Clara's heart hammered against her ribs, her imagination populating the oppressive darkness with 1,000 unseen horrors. But she pushed forward, her mind locked on a single image, her Uncle Walter's face. After what felt like an eternity of walking, Maggie stopped. "Here," she whispered, her flashlight beam landing on the tunnel wall. And Clara saw it. It wasn't just a wall. It was a gate, a massive, rusted steel plate, bolted and welded shut, so covered in grime and corrosion that it almost blended into the concrete. It was an end, a dead end. But etched into the rust, so faint it was almost invisible, were a number and a letter, the same number and letter as Walter's train line. Clara's breath caught in her throat. Frankie was right. It was real. As her flashlight beam danced over the grate, it caught something wedged in the lower corner, just inside the steel bars, something dark and misshapen. Reaching through the narrow gap, her fingers trembling, Clara pulled it out. It was a conductor's cap. The dark wool was stiff with age and stained with something she didn't want to identify, but the MTA logo on the front was still just visible. It was his. It had to be. She held it in her hands, a tangible piece of her uncle's last moments on Earth. He was here. He was right here, on the other side of this wall. A wave of triumphant, grief-stricken certainty washed over her. She wanted to shout, to weep, to claw at the steel door with her bare hands. They had found it. The truth wasn't buried, it was just locked away. This was the proof she needed. This was the hope she had been searching for. It was a moment of pure, unadulterated victory. And then, that perfect moment shattered. A siren, shrill and deafening, erupted through the tunnel, its piercing wail bouncing off the curved walls, amplifying into a physical assault on their senses. Red lights flashed, strobing down the long corridor, turning the darkness into a pulsating nightmare. They had tripped a silent alarm. "Go, now!" Maggie yelled, grabbing Clara's arm and pulling her back the way they came. They ran, their lungs burning, the horrifying sound of the alarm chasing them like a predator. As they stumbled out of the tunnel entrance, blinking against the drizzle and the flashing lights, they were met not by the police, but by two large, faceless men in dark utility uniforms. They moved with a purpose that was far more menacing than any official procedure. Before Maggie could even identify herself, one of the men shoved her hard against the corrugated metal wall of a freight container. The sound of her head hitting the steel was a sickening thud. Maggie crumpled to the ground, stunned. The other man stepped in front of Clara, his body blocking her escape, his face a mask of cold indifference. "You were warned," he said, his voice a low, flat monotone. From the shadows, a third figure emerged. Richard Hale. He was dressed in a pristine black raincoat, not a single drop of the miserable rain clinging to him. He looked at the conductor's cap in Clara's hand, then up at her face, his expression one of mild disappointment, like a teacher scolding a particularly stubborn child. "You are making this so much more difficult than it needs to be, Miss Jensen," he said, his smooth voice a stark contrast to the violence of the siren and the assault on Maggie. He took a deliberate step closer. "Trespassing on MTA property is a serious offense. We could have you arrested. Your friend, too, resisting security personnel. It would be a messy affair." He paused, letting the threat sink in. He wasn't just talking about trespassing charges. He was talking about ruining their lives, burying them in a legal morass they could never escape. He reached out and with 2 fingers plucked the conductor's cap from Clara's unresisting hand. He held it for a moment, then casually tossed it into a deep, muddy puddle. The artifact, the proof, their singular victory, vanished beneath the murky water. "Consider this your final warning," Hale said, his voice losing its polished edge and taking on the hardness of cold steel. "Stop now, or the next time we won't be so restrained." He gave a slight nod to his men. They stepped back, melting into the shadows as quickly as they had appeared. Maggie, groaning, pushed herself up, a dark trickle of blood running from a cut on her temple. They were alone again, the siren abruptly cutting off, leaving behind a ringing, terrifying silence. They half ran, half stumbled out of the freight yard, their brief moment of triumph utterly annihilated. Back in the safety of Maggie's apartment, the adrenaline gave way to a chilling, bone-deep fear. Hale hadn't just been one step ahead of them, he had been waiting for them. The security favor had been a lie. The whole thing had been a trap. He had let them find exactly what they were looking for, only to snatch it away and show them how completely he controlled the board. He wasn't just trying to scare them anymore, he was enjoying it. As Maggie pressed a bag of frozen peas to her head, wincing, Clara felt a fresh wave of guilt wash over her. Her obsession had gotten her friend hurt. But beneath the guilt and the fear, a different emotion was taking root. A cold, hard, incandescent rage. Hale had not just threatened her. He had desecrated a sacred object. He had thrown her uncle's memory into the mud. He had crossed a line. And as she looked at her tough, wounded friend, Clara knew she had crossed one too. She was no longer just searching for the truth. She was fighting a war. That night, as she lay awake, the image of the cap sinking into the muddy water burned behind her eyes. Then her phone buzzed with a text message, an unknown number. She stared at it, her finger hovering, Maggie's warning echoing in her mind. But this time was different. A strange, reckless certainty told her to look. She opened it. There was no text, just a picture, a grainy, black-and-white photograph of a young woman getting onto a subway car. The car number was 724, and in the corner of the photo, a date stamp, July 14th, 1974. Walter hadn't been alone. The photograph on her phone was like a message from a ghost. Grainy, indistinct, yet utterly electrifying. Clara stared at it for what must have been an hour, her mind racing, every nerve ending tingling. The terror of the freight yard, the brutal finality of Hale's warning, it all faded into the background, replaced by this single shocking revelation. Her uncle had not been alone. The image showed a young woman, her face partially obscured, stepping onto his train. A passenger. This changed the entire shape of the mystery. It wasn't just about a missing employee anymore. This was bigger. This was a cover-up involving the public. But who had sent it? Was it a warning or a lifeline? An ally in the shadows or another of Hale's cruel, manipulative games? The source was unknown, the intention a complete mystery, but the message was clear. There was another story here, another family shattered by that night in 1974. The despair that had threatened to swallow her whole after the confrontation with Hale was burned away by a sudden, fierce rush of adrenaline. She wasn't just fighting for her uncle's honor now. She was fighting for this forgotten woman, this unknown passenger, whose life had been erased just as completely as Walter's. The next morning, her apartment felt less like a sanctuary and more like a command center. Maggie, nursing a cup of black coffee and a spectacular bruise on her temple, looked at the anonymous text and gave a low whistle. "Well," she said, her voice dry. "Somebody's playing games. Could be Hale trying to send you down another rabbit hole, or it could be someone from the inside who's finally grown a conscience." Maggie's detective instincts kicked in. She pointed to a detail Clara had missed. "Look at her hand. She's holding a ticket." It was barely visible, a small rectangle of paper clutched in the woman's fingers. If we could find out who bought a ticket for that specific train, on that specific night. It was a needle in a 50-year-old haystack, but for a librarian like Clara, it was a challenge she was uniquely qualified for. Hope surged through her, a powerful cleansing wave. This was her territory. This was a research problem. She had an ally, she had a clue, and she had a purpose that felt bigger and more important than her own fear. Their first stop, however, was not the library. It was the post office. Late the previous night, an unmarked envelope had been slipped under Clara's door. It was thin, holding only a single piece of stiff old paper, a subway ticket stub, faded and brittle with age. Stamped on its face in faint purple ink was the date, July 14, 1974, and the time, 11:50, 2 p.m., Walter's last train. And scribbled on the back, in what looked like a woman's handwriting, was a name, Diana Reyes. The anonymous sender hadn't just given them a clue, they'd given them the answer. The photograph and the ticket stub, it was a breadcrumb trail, laid out for her to follow by someone who wanted the truth to come out, but was too terrified to step into the light themselves. For a moment, Clara felt an overwhelming sense of connection to this unknown helper, a feeling of not being quite so alone in the fight. With a name, the haystack became a filing cabinet. At the city archives, buried deep in the municipal ledgers of missing persons reports from 1974, they found her, Diana Reyes, age 23. A nursing student who worked a late shift at St. Vincent's Hospital. She had left work just after 11:30 that night to catch the subway home to Queens. She never arrived. The police report was thin, a few pages of dead ends and unanswered questions. Her family had been frantic, but with no witnesses and no evidence, her case quickly went cold, another forgotten face among the city's countless tragedies. Clara stared at the faded black-and-white photograph attached to the report. Diana Reyes had a bright, hopeful smile and dark, intelligent eyes. She looked like a young woman with her entire life ahead of her. Reading the details of her disappearance, knowing what she now knew, sent a chill down Clara's spine. 2 people, a transit operator and a passenger, vanished on the same train, on the same night, and no one in 50 years had ever connected the 2 cases. It wasn't a coincidence. It was a deliberate, calculated erasure. The scale of the cover-up was staggering. You could make one employee disappear and call it an abandonment. But a passenger? A young woman just trying to get home from her job? That was a different kind of evil. That was an unforgivable sin. The knowledge settled in Clara's gut like a block of ice. They hadn't just silenced Walter. They had sacrificed this young woman to protect their secret. It made Richard Hale's smooth threats and casual violence seem even more monstrous. Armed with this new, terrible truth, Clara found an address for Diana's surviving brother, Hector Reyes. He was now in his early 70s and still lived in the same family home in Queens. As she stood on the porch of the small, well-kept brick house, Clara felt a knot of anxiety tighten in her stomach. She was about to walk into this man's life and tear open a wound that had been festering for half a century. She was bringing him not peace, but a truth far more horrible than the mystery he had lived with. Was this the right thing to do? For a moment she hesitated, her hand hovering over the doorbell. This was a selfish, reckless act, dragging another family into her dangerous crusade. But the image of Diana's smiling face in the police report flashed in her mind. This wasn't for her, it was for Diana. She had to have a voice. Taking a deep breath, Clara rang the bell. The man who answered the door was old and weary, his shoulders stooped with the weight of a lifetime of grief. He looked at Clara with suspicion, his eyes guarded. She introduced herself, explaining as gently as she could why she was there, her uncle, the train, the ticket stub with his sister's name on it. She had expected sadness, perhaps even disbelief. She was not prepared for the explosion of rage. "Get out!" Hector Reyes hissed, his voice trembling with a fury so profound it seemed to shake his entire body. "You people are all the same, ghouls, picking at scabs. You think you're the first one to come around with some crazy story about my sister?" His face was a mask of pain and bitterness. "For years we had the psychics, the reporters, the conspiracy nuts, all of them telling us they had the answer, trying to make a name for themselves off my family's tragedy. We have mourned my sister. We have made our peace with not knowing. We do not need you, a complete stranger, coming here to sell us some new fantastic lie about a ghost train." Clara tried to explain, to show him the proof, but he wouldn't listen. To him, she was just another vulture, another person exploiting his pain for her own ends. "Diana is gone," he said, his voice breaking on her name. "Leave her memory in peace, and leave my family alone." He slammed the door in her face. The sound echoed in the quiet street, a final, brutal rejection. Clara stood on the porch, stunned, the door a solid wooden monument to her failure. The hope and righteousness that had propelled her here drained away, leaving her feeling hollowed out and deeply ashamed. He was right. What was she doing? She was a librarian, not a crusader. She was barging into people's lives, causing pain, bringing danger to her friends, all to satisfy her own need for answers. The emotional high of her discovery, the feeling of purpose, had crashed into this wall of human grief and anger. She had failed. The anonymous ally had given her the key, and she had been unable to even turn it in the lock. As she walked back to the car, defeated, she saw him, Richard Hale. He was parked across the street, sitting in the driver's seat of the same dark sedan. He wasn't hiding. He was watching her, openly. He wanted her to see him. As she fumbled for her keys, he slowly raised a hand and gave her a small, mocking wave, a thin, cruel smile on his lips. It wasn't a threat. It was a statement. He knew where she was. He knew what she was doing. He was letting her see that he was always there, that he controlled every move she made, that he could watch her fail, and that he found it all deeply, deeply amusing. The personal, devastating rejection from Hector Reyes, followed by the cold, triumphant mockery of her tormentor, was a 1-2 punch that left her breathless. The secret was bigger than she had ever imagined, and the monster guarding it was enjoying the hunt. The image of Richard Hale's mocking wave burned itself into Clara's memory. He wasn't just an obstacle, he was a spectator, enjoying a cruel game of his own design. The encounter with Hector Reyes had left her feeling like a fool, a meddler who only caused more pain. Defeated, she returned to Maggie's apartment, the silence in the car thick with her own failure. She was ready to quit. The emotional cost was too high, the enemy too powerful. But Maggie O'Connor was not a woman who accepted defeat. While Clara had been chasing the human element of the story, Maggie had been chasing the paper. "Forget the brother for now," Maggie said, her voice sharp and focused, cutting through Clara's haze of self-pity. "Grief makes people build walls. We're not getting through that one, but I got something better." She gestured to a stack of dusty, oversized ledgers spread across her dining table, salvaged from a sub-basement in the municipal building by another of her old police contacts. Property records and zoning variances from the 60s and 70s. Boring as hell, but it's where the real bodies are buried. Maggie's pragmatic determination was a lifeline. Clara, grateful for a task that required logic instead of emotion, sat down beside her. For 2 days they lived on coffee and stale bagels, their world shrinking to the dense, spidery script of city bureaucracy. They traced property lines, building permits, and public works contracts, searching for any anomaly near the 9th Avenue freight yard. The work was tedious, a maddening labyrinth of legalese and red tape. Just as Clara was about to lose hope, her eyes snagged on a footnote in a 1965 zoning application. It was an easement grant for a private utility corridor beneath a massive commercial development project. The developer's name was listed as Hale Properties, Incorporated. A jolt, sharp and electric, shot through Clara. Hale. It couldn't be a coincidence. With trembling hands, she pulled up Frankie's map on her phone. She and Maggie painstakingly overlaid the old property blueprint with the track inspector's hand-drawn sketch. The lines matched. They matched perfectly. Frankie's forbidden spur, the ghost tunnel that had swallowed her uncle's train, didn't belong to the city. It had been built illegally, a secret artery carved out beneath a private developer's land. Walter's last route hadn't just crossed a decommissioned city track, it had crossed into a private kingdom, a place that officially did not exist. A wild, triumphant hope surged through Clara, chasing away the shame of her failure with Hector Reyes. This was it. This was the motive. It wasn't about a simple accident. It was about trespass. Her uncle hadn't just vanished. He had seen something he wasn't supposed to see, driven his train into a place he was never meant to be. The discovery was a vindication of everything she had believed, everything she had fought for. She and Maggie looked at each other across the table, the dusty ledger between them, feeling more valuable than gold. They had found the secret. They finally had the leverage they needed to expose the entire 50-year-old lie. They had won. The feeling of victory lasted for exactly one day. The next morning, as Clara was heading out to meet Maggie, she saw the notice plastered on the front door of their apartment building. It was a standard City Works announcement, printed on bright orange paper. Controlled demolition. It listed the sector, the block, the very freight yard where they had found the sealed tunnel. Citing long-term structural instability, the city was scheduled to permanently seal the unused service tunnels in the area. The project was being fast-tracked for public safety. The demolition was scheduled for the following week. Clara's blood turned to ice. It was happening again. Every time she got close, Hale was there to slam the door. This wasn't a coincidence. This wasn't a matter of public safety. This was Richard Hale, using the full weight of the city's machinery to bury the evidence for good. The timing was too perfect, too precise. He was erasing the crime scene. In 1 week, her uncle's train, Diana Reyes's final resting place, the entire physical proof of the crime, would be entombed forever under thousands of tons of concrete and rock. A frantic, desperate energy seized her. The patient, methodical librarian was gone, replaced by a woman running out of time. They had to get back in there. They had to find something, anything, to stop that demolition. But this time, there would be no favors from security guards. This time, they would be walking into a trap that Hale was knowingly setting for them. The risk was enormous, a reckless gamble born of pure desperation. As if to underscore the point, the game escalated. That evening, Clara walked to her car, her mind a frantic swirl of impossible plans. She slid into the driver's seat, put the key in the ignition, and turned. Nothing. Not even a click. Just a dead, ominous silence. Annoyed, she tried again. Still, nothing. She got out of the car, a knot of unease tightening in her stomach. Kneeling down, she peered under the chassis, and then she saw it. A small, dark puddle spreading on the pavement beneath the engine block. And something else. A thin copper line snipped cleanly in two, leaking fluid onto the asphalt. Her brake line. It had been deliberately cut. She scrambled backward, her hands flying to her mouth, a silent scream lodging in her throat. This wasn't a warning anymore. This wasn't a threat to her pension or a mocking wave from across the street. This was a direct, physical attempt on her life. If she had been parked on a hill, if her car had started, if she had driven out into traffic, she would be dead. The realization hit her with the force of a physical blow. Hale was done playing. He was no longer trying to scare her off. He was trying to eliminate her. She stumbled back to her apartment, her legs shaking so violently she could barely walk. She burst into Maggie's place without knocking, babbling incoherently about the car, the brake lines. Maggie listened, her face grim, her cop instincts taking over. She went down to the car herself, took one look, and her expression hardened into a mask of cold fury. "That silver-tongued son of a bitch," she swore, her voice a low, dangerous growl. "He just declared war." That night, the two women sat in Maggie's apartment, the curtains drawn, the locks bolted. The city outside, with its millions of people, felt 1,000,000 miles away. They were on a tiny, isolated island, and the sharks were circling. The fear was back, more potent and immediate than ever before. But this time, it was mingled with something else. A pure, unadulterated rage. Hale's vicious escalation had been a profound mistake. He thought he could terrify a librarian and a retired cop into silence, but what he had done was corner them, and cornered animals are the most dangerous kind. Clara looked at Maggie, whose face was set in grim, determined lines. "He thinks he can bury my uncle," Clara said, her voice a low, trembling whisper that held not fear, but a newfound, terrifying resolve. "But he's going to have to bury us with him." The decision was made, silently, in the shared look between them. They were going in, one last time, not to find proof to show the world, but to find the truth for themselves, before it was obliterated forever. Their one tiny advantage was that Hale would be expecting them. He would be waiting for them to make a move. As Clara stared out the window into the dark, indifferent city, she saw not the end of her quest, but the beginning of its final, desperate chapter. And she knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the bone, that it was a chapter from which they might not both return. There was no turning back. The knowledge that Hale wanted her dead had a strangely clarifying effect on Clara. The fear didn't disappear, but it crystallized into a diamond-hard point of purpose. 48 hours before the demolition crews were scheduled to move in, she and Maggie prepared for their final descent. This wasn't a stealth mission anymore. It was a frontal assault on a fortress they knew was guarded. They went in not through the freight yard, which would be crawling with Hale's men, but through an old sewer access point 3 blocks away that Maggie had located on a century-old city map. The plan was reckless, a desperate final throw of the dice. Maggie had packed a heavy-duty pry bar, portable work lights, and a small, powerful digital camera. Before they left, she handed Clara a small personal locator beacon. "If we're not back in 3 hours," Maggie said, her voice grim, "this thing sends a distress signal to a friend of mine. A real friend, not one of Hale's puppets. It's our only insurance policy." The weight of the small device in Clara's pocket was a cold, constant reminder of just how high the stakes had become. The descent into the city's underbelly was a journey into another world. The air grew thick and foul, the sounds of the surface fading into a distant, muffled roar. They navigated a maze of dripping, slime-coated tunnels, following the faded markings on Maggie's map, the beams of their flashlights cutting feeble paths through the oppressive darkness. Twice, they heard the distant scrape of footsteps from connecting passages and froze, their hearts pounding in the suffocating silence, until the sounds faded away. Hale's men were down here, patrolling. They were walking directly into the lion's den. Finally, they reached the service tunnel. The air here was different, drier, filled with the dust of ages. As they approached the spot where the great steel gate had blocked their path before, Clara's breath caught. It was gone. In its place was a gaping, dark maw leading into the sealed spur. Hale hadn't just been planning to demolish the tunnel, he had been inside. He had been removing any last traces of evidence. A cold dread washed over Clara. Were they too late? Had he already moved the train, erased the final piece of the puzzle? Stepping through the opening was like stepping into a tomb. The tunnel on the other side was wider, the construction different. This wasn't a city-built passage. The walls were rougher, the ceiling lower. This was Hale Properties' secret kingdom. The silence in here was profound, a dead, ancient stillness that felt heavy, like a physical weight on their chests. And then, Maggie's light found it. At the end of the tunnel, shrouded in 50 years of darkness, was the train. It stood there, a great, metal ghost, its once bright paint, now a peeling, corroded shell. The number on the front, 724, was still faintly visible beneath a half-century of grime. Clara felt a wave of emotions so powerful it threatened to buckle her knees. Grief, awe, and a profound, heartbreaking sense of homecoming. She had found him. After 50 years, she had finally found him. She placed a hand on the cold, rusted metal of the operator's car and whispered, "Uncle Walter, I'm here." It was a moment of transcendent victory, a sacred communion with the past. But the moment was fleeting. As their lights swept over the train, they saw signs of recent activity. The graffiti that coated the cars was from the 1980s, not the 70s. Scavengers had been here over the years, but there were also fresh footprints in the thick dust on the floor. Hale's men. They had been inside the train. Maggie used the pry bar on the sealed doors of the operator's car. The metal screamed in protest before groaning open. The air that rushed out was stale and dead. Clara climbed inside, her flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. The small operator's cab was a time capsule. A thermos lay on its side. A newspaper from July 1974 was folded on the seat. It was all just as he had left it. Then she saw the logbook. It was open on the console, a thin layer of dust covering its pages. Her hands trembling, she picked it up. She turned to the last entry, dated July 14, 1974. The handwriting was her uncle's, familiar from old birthday cards and letters. But the last few lines were different. They were a frantic, desperate scrawl, the pencil having dug deep into the paper. "Doors sealed," he had written. "No way out. Someone locked us in." The words hit Clara with the force of a physical blow. He hadn't crashed. He hadn't been in an accident. He had been deliberately, methodically, entombed. This wasn't a tragic mistake. It was a cold-blooded murder. This logbook was the confession, the definitive, undeniable proof of the crime. She held it to her chest, a sob catching in her throat. She had found his final words. She had found his voice. It was at that exact moment that she had the stunning, clarifying realization that had been hiding in plain sight all along. Hale Properties. Richard Hale. "Maggie," she said, her voice shaking with the force of the discovery. His father, Richard Hale's father, was the developer. Hale Properties. It was his tunnel. The cover-up, it's a family legacy. He's protecting his father. The full, monstrous scope of the conspiracy finally snapped into focus. It was a secret passed down from one generation to the next, a crime buried not just in the earth, but in the silence of a powerful family. She pulled out her camera and began taking pictures, frantically documenting everything, the logbook, the cab, the tunnel. She had to get this out. She had to show the world. And that's when they heard it, a low, ominous groaning sound from deep within the earth. Dust and small pebbles began to rain down from the ceiling. The tunnel was shifting. The demolition hadn't been scheduled for next week. It had been a lie. It was happening now. As the groaning grew louder, a section of the tunnel ceiling near the entrance collapsed, a cascade of rock and dirt blocking their way out. The air filled with a choking cloud of dust. Then, through the haze, they saw them. Two of Hale's men, standing on the other side of the rubble, their faces grim, their flashlights pinning Clara and Maggie in their beams. They weren't trying to rescue them. They were watching them. They were making sure the job was finished. "He's burying us!" Maggie yelled, her voice raw with disbelief and fury. "The bastard is going to leave us in here to die, just like your uncle." Panic, pure and primal, seized Clara. The walls were closing in, the air was growing thick, and the men who worked for her tormentor were standing by, watching them suffocate. She was trapped. She was living her uncle's final moments. She was going to die in this tomb, her promise unfulfilled, the truth dying with her. Then she remembered. The beacon. With fumbling, dust-caked fingers, she pulled the small device from her pocket. Her thumb hovered over the panic button. This was it, their one, desperate, last-ditch hope. But as her thumb pressed down on the small button, another section of the ceiling gave way, much closer this time. A large chunk of concrete crashed down onto the operator's cab, striking Maggie a glancing blow and sending her sprawling. The logbook flew from Clara's grasp, skittering across the floor and sliding into a dark, widening crevice in the collapsing tunnel floor. The confession, her uncle's last words, the one piece of physical proof they had, it was gone. And as the beams of the flashlights from Hale's men flickered and disappeared behind the ever-growing wall of rubble, Clara was left in the terrifying, rumbling darkness, with an injured friend and the horrifying certainty that help, if it was coming at all, would never arrive in time. The darkness was a living thing. It pressed in on Clara from all sides, thick with the choking dust of the collapse. The terrifying rumble of shifting earth subsided, replaced by an even more terrifying silence. The silence of a tomb. For a moment she was utterly paralyzed by a despair so profound it felt like a physical death. The logbook, the one irrefutable piece of evidence, was gone, swallowed by the earth. Maggie was hurt. They were buried alive. Hale had won. He had perfectly, brutally won. But then she heard a low groan from the floor of the cab. "Maggie?" Clara scrambled over, her hands searching in the absolute blackness. "Maggie, are you okay?" A weak voice answered. "Peachy. Just had a rock fall on me." "What the hell happened?" That voice, laced with its usual dry sarcasm, even in the face of death, was the spark that reignited Clara's will to live. They were not dead yet. "He collapsed the tunnel," Clara explained, her own voice a strained whisper. "Hale's men were on the other side. They're trying to bury us." She remembered the locator beacon, still clutched in her hand. Had it worked? Had the signal even made it through tons of rock and soil? The hope was so fragile it was almost painful to hold on to. "My camera," she said, a new thought cutting through the panic. "I was taking pictures of the logbook. The pictures are on the camera." It was a slim chance. If the camera had survived the collapse, if the memory card was intact, they might still have something. Groping in the dark, she felt around the dusty floor, her fingers brushing against twisted metal, sharp rocks, and then, miraculously, the smooth, cool plastic of the camera body. It was cracked, but it seemed to be in one piece. This tiny victory, finding this small object in the overwhelming darkness, felt monumental. It was a flicker of light in an ocean of despair. An hour passed, or maybe it was a day. Time had ceased to have meaning in the suffocating blackness. They spoke in low whispers, conserving air, their conversation a fragile thread against the crushing silence. Maggie had a nasty gash on her head, and her leg was likely broken, but she was lucid, her cop's mind working through the tactical nightmare of their situation. Clara, meanwhile, found her thoughts drifting back to her uncle. She was now trapped in the very same fate he had endured. She could feel his terror, his hopelessness, his final lonely moments in this cold, dark place. And in that shared experience, a strange and powerful peace settled over her. She had not just found his story, she had lived it. She had fulfilled her promise not just by uncovering the truth, but by bearing witness to it in the most intimate way imaginable. The despair began to recede, replaced by a calm, almost serene acceptance. And then they heard it. A faint, rhythmic tapping sound from far away. It was metal on rock. At first, Clara thought she was imagining it, a hallucination brought on by a lack of oxygen. But then Maggie heard it too. "Listen," she whispered, her voice tight with a hope she didn't dare express. The tapping grew louder, more distinct. It was the sound of rescue. Maggie's friend. The beacon had worked. An overwhelming wave of relief, so powerful it made her feel weak, washed over Clara. Tears streamed down her dusty face, not of fear, but of pure, unadulterated joy. They were going to live. The truth was going to get out. As the sound of drilling and heavy machinery grew closer, a new sound joined it, shouting. And through a small crevice in the rubble, a bright, powerful beam of light sliced through the darkness. It was the most beautiful thing Clara had ever seen. When the rescue workers finally broke through, creating a hole just big enough to crawl through, the first face Clara saw was not a paramedic or a firefighter. It was Frankie Alvarez. The old track inspector stood there, his wrinkled face a mixture of terror and fierce determination, flanked by a phalanx of grim-faced police officers. "I told them," Frankie cried, his voice breaking with emotion as he saw her. "After what they did to me, I couldn't live with the silence anymore. I told them everything. I told them where to find you." His guilt, the poison that had eaten at him for 50 years, had finally become too much to bear. Maggie's emergency protocol, her beacon, hadn't just brought a rescue team, it had brought the one man whose testimony could corroborate their entire story. The truth hadn't been lost in the collapse. It had been shouting from the surface the entire time. As Clara and a badly injured Maggie were helped out of the collapsed tunnel, the scene that greeted them was one of controlled chaos. Police lights painted the freight yard in strobing blues and reds. And standing in the middle of it all, looking utterly bewildered and out of place in his perfect, expensive suit, was Richard Hale. He had a look of stunned disbelief on his face, the look of a king whose castle had just been breached. He was in conversation with a stern-faced detective, his hands moving in smooth, placating gestures. And then, as the detective asked him a particularly pointed question, Clara saw it, his hand. It went to his chest, and his fingers made that familiar, unconscious gesture, a smooth, downward stroke of his tie. It was his tell. The little gesture that betrayed the vast, ugly lie he had spent his life protecting. A moment later, the detective spoke into his radio. Uniformed officers stepped forward. Richard Hale, the untouchable, polished pillar of the community, was being placed under arrest. Watching them put the handcuffs on him, Clara felt a surge of cold, satisfying justice that was more potent than any relief. He had tried to bury her, but in the end his own legacy, his own lies, had buried him. At the police station, the story poured out of them. Clara, exhausted and covered in grime, laid out the entire conspiracy, from her uncle's whistle to the illegal spur to Hale's threats and the final murderous act of collapsing the tunnel. The camera, miraculously, had survived. The photographs of Walter's final, desperate message in the logbook were clear and undeniable. And Frankie Alvarez, his voice trembling but steady, confirmed it all, 50 years of pent-up truth flooding out of him in a cleansing, cathartic confession. But the biggest shock came late that night. As investigators began cross-referencing old missing persons reports with the location of the illegal spur, they made a horrifying discovery. Walter's train wasn't the only one. Over the years, several other minor derailments and service interruptions in that sector, all written off as mechanical failures, aligned perfectly with other unsolved disappearances from the early 70s. Diana Reyes had been the first, but she was not the last. Hale's father, and later Hale himself, had not just covered up a single accident. They had used their secret tunnel as a disposal ground, a place where inconvenient people and problems could be made to vanish. The scale of the crime was almost unimaginable, a hidden, decades-long reign of terror operating in the dark spaces beneath the city's feet. The victory was absolute, the truth more shocking than she could have ever imagined. Hale was exposed, his family's dark secret laid bare for the entire world to see. Justice, it seemed, had finally been served, but amidst the flashing cameras and the screaming headlines, a quiet, heartbreaking reality set in. In the chaos of the tunnel collapse, Walter's train had been almost completely buried. Recovery crews determined it was too unstable, too dangerous to excavate any further. They would never be able to recover his remains, or the remains of Diana Reyes, or any of the other souls lost in that dark place. The train that had been his life's work had become his tomb. Clara had found the truth. She had cleared his name, but she could not bring him home. The logbook was lost forever, and the only proof of his final words were the photographs she had taken in the darkness. She had won, but the cost was a permanent, aching void where closure should have been. The truth was out, but her uncle was still, and always would be, lost. The media storm that followed the arrest of Richard Hale was a hurricane of headlines and 24-hour news cycles. The story of the ghost train of 9th Avenue was a sensation, a modern myth brought violently to life. Hale's face was plastered everywhere, his polished smile now looking like a ghoulish mask in the face of the horrifying accusations. The MTA, exposed and humiliated, was forced to admit the existence of the illegal spur, its carefully constructed history crumbling under the weight of Clara's evidence. The city reeled from the revelation of a deep generational corruption that had festered right beneath its streets. For the world, it was a shocking, spectacular story of justice served. For Clara, it was something much quieter and infinitely more complicated. The noise of the victory felt hollow, a distant echo of the profound silence she had experienced in the tunnel. A month after their rescue, the city held a small official vigil at the now permanently sealed entrance to the freight yard tunnel. It was a cold, windswept autumn day. City officials in dark suits gave somber, carefully worded speeches, their faces a public performance of remorse. Clara stood a little way off from the main crowd, next to Maggie, whose leg was in a cast but whose spirit was as indomitable as ever. Clara wasn't listening to the speeches. She was watching the faces in the small crowd reserved for the victims' families. She saw Hector Reyes, Diana's brother, standing with his own grown children, His face was no longer a mask of anger, but of a quiet, bottomless sorrow. He had finally learned the truth about his sister's disappearance, a truth far crueler than any fiction he could have imagined, and she saw Mark, her cousin, standing alone at the very back, his face pale and unreadable. He had come. That, at least, was something. After the speeches were over and the news crews had packed away their cameras, Hector Reyes walked over to her. He didn't say a word at first, just looked at her with eyes that held 50 years of pain. "I'm sorry," he said finally, his voice raspy, "for how I spoke to you. I didn't want to believe it." It was easier to believe she was just gone than to believe that someone did this to her. Clara simply nodded, unable to speak past the lump in her throat. There were no words that could bridge the chasm of his grief. "Thank you," he added, his voice cracking, "for not letting her be forgotten." He reached out and briefly squeezed her arm before turning and walking back to his family. The moment was a small, fragile point of light in the vast darkness of the tragedy, a moment of human connection that felt more real and more important than all the headlines and televised press conferences. Justice wasn't just about putting a villain in jail, it was about giving a name back to the forgotten. Then, she saw Mark approaching. His steps were hesitant, his expression conflicted. She steeled herself for another wave of anger, of recrimination. But when he finally stood in front of her, his eyes were filled not with rage, but with a profound, shattered confusion. "I spent my whole life hating him," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "I built my whole life on the foundation of hating the man who walked out on us. And now, you've taken that away. You've told me he wasn't a coward. You've told me he was a hero." He looked away, toward the sealed tunnel entrance, as if he could see through the layers of steel and concrete to the father he never knew. "I don't know who I am anymore if I'm not the son of the man who ran away. I don't know how to live with this other story, the one where he died alone in the dark, trying to protect his passengers." He looked back at Clara, and for the first time, she saw not the bitter, angry man, but the heartbroken little boy who had been left behind. "You wanted to give him his honor back," Mark said, his voice breaking. "But what about me? What am I supposed to do with this truth? It's too heavy, Clara. It's just too heavy." He turned and walked away. Not in anger this time, but in a sorrow so deep it felt like a final, unbridgeable distance between them. She had won the war for her uncle's memory, but in doing so, she had lost her last remaining family. The victory was a bitter ash in her mouth. Back in her apartment, the silence that had once been her comfort now felt different. It was filled with the ghosts of the story she had unearthed. She took the 2 objects she had recovered from her uncle's trunk, the tarnished brass whistle and the conductor's cap she had pulled from the muddy puddle that night, and placed them in a simple, glass-fronted memorial case. They looked small and insignificant, hardly fitting relics for such a monumental story. She placed the case on her mantelpiece, a quiet, personal monument to the man with the kind eyes. She thought about his final, scrawled words in the logbook. "Doors sealed, no way out." He had died a prisoner, but he had died at his post. He had never abandoned his duty. Standing there, in the quiet of her living room, she whispered to the empty space. "You kept your post, Uncle Walter. You didn't run. You stayed with your passengers. You're home now." The national sensation would eventually fade. The news cycle would move on. Richard Hale would be convicted and sentenced to life in prison, his smooth, smiling face finally replaced by the grim, numbered reality of a prison jumpsuit. The MTA would pay out millions in settlements to the families of the victims. But the true story, the human story, would live in the quiet moments that followed. It would live in Hector Reyes's quiet gratitude. It would live in Mark's unbearable, lonely grief. It would live in Frankie Alvarez finally being able to sleep through the night, his 50-year-old burden finally lifted, and it would live in Clara. She was no longer just a retired librarian. She was a woman who had walked into the darkness and faced down monsters, both human and psychological. She had been tested, threatened, and nearly broken. But she had endured. One evening, a few weeks later, Maggie O'Connor, now walking with a cane but with the same wry glint in her eye, knocked on her door. "Thought you might be rattling around in here," she said. "Come on, Let's get some air." They walked in the cool evening twilight through the familiar anonymous streets of their neighborhood. They didn't talk about the tunnel, or about hail, or about any of the darkness they had passed through. They talked about books and bad television and the weather. They just walked. As they turned a corner, Maggie reached out and put a steadying hand on Clara's shoulder. It was a simple, comforting gesture of friendship, of solidarity. And in that moment, Clara understood the true nature of her victory. The truth was not a headline. It was not a conviction. It was the quiet, unbreakable bond forged between two ordinary women who had refused to let the darkness win. For the first time in 50 years, the truth was above ground, and so was she.